Back when I used to drive for Uber, I had my fair share of interesting passengers, from rowdy groups on Saturday nights to those who tried to get free rides by faking disabilities. But let me tell you about this one passenger, Tom, who was a whole different level of unsettling. This happened a couple of years ago on a freezing Friday night in December. I was 18, driving my brand new Honda Accord. My parents had pampered me a bit, but they also warned me to keep a blade in the car. You never know who you might pick up, right? So I get this pickup request from a guy named Tom, a few miles away near a major shopping area. As I pull up in front of the shopping center, I notice a group of teenagers hanging around, and it looked like they were up to no good. I really hoped Tom wasn't part of that crew. As I drove further into the parking lot to avoid them, I did a couple of laps, and that's when I saw someone approaching my car from behind. I rolled down my window and called out, "Tom." It took a few tries to get his attention, which was a bit weird right from the start. Finally, he walked around to the back and got into the seat right behind me. Now, most passengers I picked up would sit diagonally from me, which was what I preferred. But when someone sat right behind me, especially if they seemed creepy, it made me uneasy. Tom was an older guy, maybe in his 40s, and he sounded like a heavy smoker. Come to think of it, my car was starting to reek of cigarettes. He gave me an address that was 10 miles away, which was fine because it meant more money for me. I tried to make some small talk initially, but it didn't go well. He'd mumble or give me one-word answers, and eventually I just stopped talking when he completely ignored one of my questions. We were about 5 miles in, with 5 more to go, and I was getting increasingly uncomfortable. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror because I could sense that he was staring at me. When I finally glanced at the mirror, my suspicions were confirmed. He was definitely watching me. As we hit the 6-mile mark, I realized we were in the middle of nowhere, driving down a deserted street with woods on both sides and only the occasional building. I started to grow suspicious of the address he'd given me. So while driving, I discreetly checked the map on my phone. It seemed like the address led to a dead-end street with no other roads nearby. My nerves were on edge, and I looked back in the mirror. He was still staring at me. Summoning all my courage, I asked him if that address was his house. There was a moment of silence, and I thought he might ignore me again or hadn't heard me, but then he finally answered, "Yes." With less than a mile to go, we were in this remote, dark area, surrounded by woods and the occasional eerie-looking building. I pretended to miss the turn, hoping he wouldn't notice. But he did, and he insisted we turn around. I apologized and quickly did a 3-point turn. At this point, I was freaking out and had a blade ready in my right hand just in case. I drove down the dead-end road, and all I could see were trees on either side, pitch black. When we reached the end of the road, there was not a single house or building in sight. I knew something was about to go down, and I mentally prepared myself. Suddenly, he said in the softest voice he could muster, "Thanks for the ride." I wasn't even thinking about money at this point. He opened his door, but before getting out, he said, "Could you get out of the car for a second? I need help carrying my bag. I've got a bad back." But here's the thing. He didn't have a bag with him when he got in. I replied, "Yeah, sure, let yourself out and I'll help you in a sec." My voice was trembling, and he could probably tell how scared I was. What happened next I could never have imagined. Out of nowhere, I felt pressure on my neck. It took me a second to realize that he was choking me from the back seat. In pure panic, I used my blade to hurt him, and he screamed in pain, releasing his grip on my neck. He fell out of the car onto the street. I didn't waste a second. I turned the car around and floored it down the street until I reached a busy road. I didn't call the cops. I was just too terrified. When I got home, all I wanted to do was forget about it and sleep. Needless to say, I quit driving for Uber after that. So, this happened about 6 months ago, and I just recently took an Uber for the first time since this creepy incident, so I figured I'd share it with you all. I was leaving a work function at a bar, and it was around midnight. I work in a big city about an hour away from the suburban home I share with my partner. Just to give you some context, I'm a woman in my mid-20s, pretty average build, not tall, not strong, definitely not intimidating in any way. That night, I was a bit buzzed, I'd say about 3 drinks in, so I was far from being completely wasted. Usually I'd take a company car home, but this time I didn't reserve one because I wasn't sure when I'd be leaving. So, I decided to take an Uber instead. The company reimburses me for it, so it's all the same to me. When the Uber pulls up, I say my goodbyes to my colleagues and hop into the back seat. I usually try to be polite and strike up a conversation with the driver, and this time was no different. Let's call this driver Ed, because I didn't know his real name. He seemed perfectly normal, no red flags whatsoever. We chatted pleasantly for about 15 minutes as we left the city and headed toward the suburbs. Our conversation eventually petered out, so I decided to take out my phone, maybe scroll through Reddit or something. Out of nowhere, Ed suggests that I take a nap if I'm feeling tired. Now, initially, I didn't think much of it, so I thanked him for the offer but politely declined, saying I wasn't that tired. But then he says something that really gave me the creeps. I always get sleepy when I'm drunk. Are you sure? At that point, I felt a jolt of alertness go through me. I told him again that I didn't need a nap and that I'd be home soon. He dropped the subject, but I couldn't shake the weirdness of his comment. About 5 minutes later, he starts talking about some weird construction on the highway, claiming it would make the trip longer. He asked if it was okay to take a different route. I reluctantly agreed, still feeling uneasy. It was then that my partner called, asking when I'd be home. I made sure to make it crystal clear that I was talking to my significant other because something just didn't feel right. After I hung up, Ed remained silent, and we exited the highway on an unfamiliar exit. I started to get worried, but I figured maybe he knew a shortcut or something. Still, I was glued to my phone, not wanting to engage with him. That's when he suddenly said, "My house is only 5 minutes away from here." Now, I'm really starting to panic. I was at least 25 minutes away from my house at this point, and this detour was making me super uncomfortable. I tried to play it cool, making up stuff about how I liked the neighborhood and how my boyfriend and I had considered moving there. Anything to make it seem like I wasn't onto his weirdness. To my surprise, he didn't respond, but then he started driving in the direction of my house. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the crisis was over. But it wasn't. With 15 minutes still to go, he started making inappropriate comments about my boyfriend, asking personal questions and suggesting things that made me extremely uncomfortable. I finally decided to use my boyfriend as a shield and told him that my boyfriend was expecting me home any minute, and I loved him. I practically begged him to just take me home. I even mentioned that I carried a small knife and mace, trying to appeal to his better judgment. Miraculously, it worked. He didn't say another word and drove me home in silence, which was creepy in its own way. He lingered as I walked to my front door before finally driving off. I reported the incident to Uber, but I couldn't help but think how lucky I was that I kept my wits about me that night. Who knows what could have happened if I hadn't. Hello, everyone. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful or entertaining, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Your support motivates us to create more content you'll love. Thanks a million. And if you've just subscribed, please drop a comment saying I subscribed. We'd love to welcome you to our community.